Hello there, gentlemen and ladies. This interesting discussion today will be centered around a topic I find very effective in communicating the relationship between aesthetics and art, but also style and ornamentation as we use it as a function of our day-to-day lives. So uniforms in general are super important, and we've, at least culturally, embedded them into how we understand our place in society, how we function, and what it means in terms of significance and this underlying metaphysical position that we take in the Faustian realm of what a knight and a knightly aspect is. I think it's best to probably start with the function of a knight being this protector, man of virtues, of ideals, and the upholder of, you could say, all that is good, and good in this sense being his own perception of what a virtuous existence is. So there's a protective nature to a knight's existence, and then this is just reflected in how we both understand why they wear suits of armor and chose to live in castles protecting certain parts of the world, versus, as I said with before, the Viking aspect, which is a man on adventures and quests and deeds. I think Sigurd is quite a good example of a knightly and virtuous man on a quest that necessarily relates to something not tied directly to the Viking instinct as much. But in general, it's quite good, I think, if you can conceptualize a knight as this, well, Heimdall here, I think, is illustrative quite well of what we mean when we say knight is a man with a protective instinct on Bifrost, and then with his Gjallarhorn ready to sound the invasion of Midgard. So for him, as to embody this knightly virtue is more or less his core purpose for being, and this drives him, this motivates him, and this is his raison d'être, if you would say that. This can be seen, well, here it's an actor playing Rollo, but Rollo was the Norman king who went from being a Viking to being a knightly figure, and probably this proto-knight for the wider Western Europe around upholding virtue from a position of power and strength, and not necessarily looking to take advantage of others but protect them. And this duality of his experience is emblematic of our own split and dichotomy in our Faustian soul. The quote here I have from Spengler is super important to understand why we can think about uniforms and aesthetics in terms of clothing, as well as that as a function of ornamentation. And he distinguishes ornamentation from imitation, and he goes on to say that ornament detaches itself now from imitation as something which does not follow the stream of life but rigidly faces it. Instead of physiognomic traits overheard in the alien being, we have established motives, symbols which are impressed upon it. Every imitation possesses beginning and end, while ornament possesses only duration. At the last, when civilization sets in, true ornament and, with it, great art as a whole are extinguished. So it's quite useful in this regard to understand that the knightly aspect remains unchanged. The manifestation of it, or how it is represented incarnate, can change, and the styles of how we understand a knightly figure looks have certainly changed, but what the established notion is remains consistent across time. And that's why there is this imitation versus ornament, and why sometimes the thought of imitation having a beginning and end really doesn't make sense here, because there's no imitation for a knight. They are representing something that is timeless. It's the infinite protective nature, both bounded with no space or time for a knight, in that he would transcend all to protect all. So what I've done here is illustrated a little bit, hopefully finding it useful to understand the different aesthetics that have been centered around this across the ages of the Faustian culture. And we can see here from King Henry, and how ostentatiously garbed he is, and how his use of clothing, and obviously this was still in tune with the times, was to project this power, and his power is a visual, and it's as you say, intuitive, that when you see a man like this, he is the king, and he's standing as a king established for a kingdom that represents something, which is a very powerful message to be able to send just from the way that you dress, right? And there has to be probably something to be said around the men who would serve a king and represent his values necessarily become knights, and the long tradition of knighthood has been extended, you could say, from the 8th century Germanic tribes all the way up until what would have been the 18th century, when the conscription and mass warfare took over from this individualistic and knightly aspect of what war sometimes was. When you have commoners taking the place of professional soldiers, then you lose obviously a lot of the romanticism around what it takes to be in form as a knight, so the training, the duty bound, all these sort of natures. And so when you think then how this represents the duality maybe of Tyr, and how Tyr himself as a god is martial prowess and might, but also the instinct to protect, a bit like Forseti with his judgment and justice, and how we can anticipate other ornamentation around, as I say, this split stylistically, and then we can say what the Herseer or the Thane in ancient times would have represented as a knight, both from serving the king or your liege, but also representing ideas. And these are social ideas around what you can say this is a Faustian soul, but this early Teutonic spirit. The progress, you might call it, and the peak, you could say, of knightly garb was this Landshankt, the complete and utter almost pageantry, but this stylistic choice to be as colourful, as bombastic, as ostentatious as possible, because when you look on a man who represents values, you need to know how strong and powerful he is, and that the use of colours and pomposity is this representation of what knightly virtues relates to in terms of status and function and performance. It's also something to do with wealth, and successful knights tend to also have been wealthy, and nothing speaks more to wealth than nice armor, a nice sword, weapons, these sort of affectations. You can see here with the Royal Hussar in his pink cherry picker pants, the same exact stylistic choices around distinguishing from a common soldier to what is perceived as much more skilled but also virtuous. And this is where you get this notion of gentleman. Now, a gentleman is a very classic symbol which was transformed out of armed service, so it's not this class aspect necessarily from the economic side, but it's much more related to the knightly side and this bureaucratic, orderly, you could say almost Prussian notion around duty to serve, and that there is a representation of status from that can transcend wealth in some ways. And so you do get this gentleman, and the gentleman is interesting because he has led to what is modern Western fashion for successful, particularly businessmen, because he was able to transform, as you can see here, into this hunting attire that's particularly strong in England, where you had tweed suits where men would go out hunting foxes and other animals, deer, etc. Deerstalker being represented here by Sherlock, and his garb I think is quite a good representation of what it means to be this knightly figure in a more modern sense, but being so intuitively understood from the way you dress with the deerstalker and the pipe and the magnifying glass, that you are someone who's protecting and serving in a much more well, in this case modern, but a timeless fashion that will always for the next 300 years understand that the man who looks like this represents something. The businessman is also a reflection of this, at least in his attire, if not his behaviors. But we tend to think of men in tuxedos and these white tie dress with petticoat and tails and all this sort of stuff as more aristocratic, but the aristocratic basically being a reflection of, as I said before, previously gentlemen and then before that knights. So the martial and the knightly retinues have had this fashion tied directly to them, which was not related directly to the merchant classes or the priestly classes or the underclasses and the working labour classes, or even the fourth estate, the mass common class, who basically derive all their notions of what you might call posh, but imitation, from the class above them. And what's seen as good and strong, rightly enough, is the knightly classes, and so everyone seems to try to imitate them in that function. We can see this in the development here, just quickly, as even school uniforms, particularly in the Anglosphere, where there's an emphasis around a functional style and fashion, which will then progress into what we would consider a respectable garb, and the ladies themselves taking very distinct choices but are representative of the same visual aspects. So the peasant woman and the aristocratic dame are not necessarily distinguished other than the type, or at least the expensiveness, but their materials and the types of style choices showing a emblematic wealth factor rather than necessarily a purity or a virtue factor, which both can embody. You can be very poor and virtuous, and you can be very rich and virtuous, in the same way that ladies are the best representation of this. On the other, for men though, you have, and this maybe is reflected in more modern representations of knights, but martial men, is to say the Bolsheviks here, who dress quite slovenly and look very disheveled and in piecemeal uniform, non-matching and slouching in the way that they're not dressed in any way that's coherent with, I would say, virtue. And this can be reflected in their mass psychology, and the reason behind Marxism in general is a ugly sort of unintuitive philosophy to live life by in the West, which is why Marxism and communism in general is not very well received in the West, because it's quite an alien understanding, and that comes down to Marx's conception around materiality, which can't be transcendent and is not reflective of the metaphysics of the West. The modern representations of things like Antifa are basically just a carryover effect here, where the very modern Antifa martial man is seen as a weakling and needs huge mass crowds to impose themselves, and it's still this disorderly mess where there's no coherent stylistic choice, there's no embrace of this aesthetic and pleasing knightly garb, because strength and honor and all these characteristics like courage need to be represented visually, and they would only do that if you felt the need to. Now, we can reduce this down to the base level, which is to say a man who fights, and I've got it here with Rollo, but a man who fights without uniform, without armor, would still have what we would consider a knightly visage or aspect, which is this large muscles, or like strong strength and representation of physique, with potentially tattoos which signify and define meanings directed both towards the gods but then to his enemies. And so even on a very, if everyone was naked level, we would still recognize intuitively what a knight, or who a knight could be, versus the masses and the weaklings and the leftist, you would say, canaille. In the contrast, and particularly from that, is this. I've just got a selection here of El Duce's Musketeers, but the embrace of, and particularly in World War II, you could say fascist ideals around uniform and pageantry, because they understood that aesthetics had this powerful symbolic feeling, and that there's more likely to be an embrace of ideology that appreciates beauty and has a goal around orderliness and a strict set of values and structure, versus having an incoherent mess which is trying to congregate a bunch of indiscriminate and discordant people. In which case we can then appreciate, from at least a visual perspective, that the Musketeers versus the Bolsheviks, and you can sense who is probably the more formidable fighters, even though in a real battle, maybe particularly with modern arms, we wouldn't be able to tell necessarily. It's still to say that if we utilize, and what I say is this ornamentation factor, this is that the transcendent, timeless appreciation of the knightly garb and the knightly aspect, we now can obviously just relate that to any type of garb. And modern soldiers, I think, are in an unfortunate position that modern wars don't necessarily call for aesthetically pleasing uniforms, and that all the typical uniforms now are functional, and function being the opposite of what you would call ornament. It's very time limited, It's got an expiry date. They use different measures around efficiency and costs and optimization on military tactics, rather than if you go back 300, 400 years where color, style, and there was obviously things like music in war. So you would have drummers, you would have trumpeters, all of this in their fine livery, versus you have very drab camouflage, utilitarian warfare nowadays. So the modern knight has basically undergone a transformation back to this knight, but a very primeval knightly aspect is now reigning once again, where a man who has an imposing physique and is attuned to what are good and upstanding ideals, and the way he cuts himself and represents himself is now that new knight. And going forward, that's how you'll have to understand the knightly aspect can only be transferred into future generations if it's appreciated in its ornamentational infinite guise. And that you, if you yourself want to become a knight and you feel it deep in your soul that that's who you are, then you can pursue something like politics and represent the knightly virtues of the Faustian man in a way that's coherent with what a knight would have done 1,000 years ago, which once again is maybe not as sexy as going out and defending a castle against the barbarous hordes, but at the same time there is this notion of duty and service above pecuniary and economic reward, which is what the businessman is obviously geared towards, and that's a much more Viking aspect. So if you are knightly and you do perceive that to be your calling, it's your vocation as a very core concept of who you are and your being in your soul, then that is my recommendation to you. You pursue what we would call the Prussian ideal, Frederick the Great being the first servant of the state, this idea that duty can take its preeminent place above any, well, monetary but definitely material awards. And it's from this phenomena that we can at least represent modern uniforms. The way that you look is very important, and that it's not enough to follow these fitness influencers or these newfangled YouTubers who are saying, you know, dress like this, get this haircut. It has to be spiritually who you are for it to make its mark on your physiognomy. In here, your soul will speak to you as the knightly regard, and that you're necessarily going to perform actions, and you'll have bravery, and you'll put yourself in extreme scenarios where courage is required. And to do that, you need to be prepared, and you need to be prepared in extremis. It can't be a preparation around mundane and quotidian daily duties. It has to be that there will be a case and a calling for me to be an extremely proficient and skilled knight in whatever way that might manifest. And that could be, like I say, politically, and it means you need to be a good speaker and a good debater and have ideas and have a coherent personal philosophy. But at the same time, you still need to look like someone people would vote for. And if you are pursuing politics, then that is the idea, that you are representing the best of us, and that should hopefully lead you into a bit better understanding of what needs to be done from your end to then be this powerful knightly man.